Here we go.
I'm just gonna let you know, Jamie, whatever the voodoo magic you put on my things, I still don't have what you sent me in the picture. So if you don't mind flipping through, that'll be great.
Okay, I'll do it.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get the statement out of the way since you're forcing me to read it this time. I think I just went through this, Jamie and I just went through the statement with the commissioners, but y'all get to, apparently we're going to have to do this every meeting. So the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are intended to reflect the current BEP funding formula, or not intended to reflect the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding form. Ooh. All right, so we're through our statement, framing statement, and if you'll go to the next slide, please, Jamie.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about any follow-ups from meeting 2. And then one of the things we really need to start hammering out, and Jamie and I were talking about this earlier, is that she really encouraged us in those buckets that we looked at last meeting about some must-haves, hope to have, the different, per our recommendations, that we need to get something in each category, because if we only have something in the bucket of the must-haves, then that's something that might be cut out. So just keep that in mind as we're talking today, before we get to that point in the meeting, that we need to have something in the should have, nice to have, and long shot buckets as well, so that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, and the things that we really feel like need to be in there might get cut out. So with that in mind, just think about that. And as we get to that point in the meeting, we need to start putting something on paper that we can start organizing our thoughts around. So if you go to that next slide, please, Jamie. And next one, friendly reminders that all this information Jamie's been sending to us ahead of time. So if you get a chance, review it, because we're not going to go over all this background information in our meetings. Our meetings really designed to, especially from here on out, getting proactive in the recommendations and just the discussions we want to have about any a change to the formula or coming up with a new formula. So please take time to look at that background information. I know it was a lot this past time. If you look through the examples from other states that we might learn from, and some of the that other background information, but it'll be worth it to help us make these conversations, maximize the time we have together. And then if you have the opportunity to engage within your network and your stakeholder groups, that will help us as well, because they're looking for our unique perspective within our demographic that we represent in the state. But also keep in mind that you are subject matter experts in this particular lane that we've been charged with coming up with recommendations. So feel free to obviously give your opinion and help inform these different buckets we're going to make recommendations in, because that's why you were chosen out of everyone in the state. So you're an expert, so we want your feedback as much or more than anybody else's. And there's no limitations on who you talk to. I talk to everyone from K-12 space, post-secondary, as well as the workforce and economic development folks. So feel free to pull from as many stakeholder groups as you can. All right, next slide, please, Jamie. And I've already talked about yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you already kind of covered that one.
Yeah.
We'll jump right into the feedback summary.
Let's do it.
All right. Well, this is the graphic that I tried to drop in the chat. However, for some odd reason, I think Teams is having a moment. Yeah, so it didn't drop in, so I emailed it to the group. But this is the graphic that you'll get. You'll see that it kind of starts out, the bottom is the base, then we will get into weights, then district funding, and then outcomes. And so right down there at the bottom of that slide, and Jared, this is where you just really jump in, and it links directly back to what the commissioner was just saying about an hour ago, is some serious trends have come out of public comment already. Those collected from town halls, from study councils. So heavy requested areas already, very, very specific. But you're going to see, I'm just going to show you just a minute, just a preview. These next 4 slides is when Jared's really going to get into like what is each one of these. Kind of detailed base, weights, additional dollars, and outcomes, which will kind of help you frame up today once we get back to that list of brainstorming components we came up with last time, and just really try to think through how do we start categorizing this. So that is in your email. And Jared, I'm just going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and another thing to keep in mind that the commissioner was talking about on that call Jamie and I were on earlier is that they're going to make additional subject matter experts within that have an expertise around funding and education funding. It'll be a combination of PhD type folks from post-secondary that all the way to people that write policy around ed funding and have, so you've got a mix of people in the field and people in higher ed that this is what they do for a living and their work revolves around. So we will be able to pull from that pool of experts, and you can have them sit in with our meetings and answer questions as needed or clarify things to help to explain what other states might be doing, if we just need clarity on some of the topics we've been discussing. So keep that in mind as well. Make a note if there's something you feel like we need more of an expert opinion and perspective on, we can pull them in our future meetings. Yes, Pat.
What we're seeing on this slide here, overall feedback received general, this is not feedback that's specifically for our subcommittee, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so these are like major themes that have been kind of distilled by the Department of Ed based on all of the feedback they've gotten from all the sources?
Correct.
Thank you.
That there would be a paralegal that coded the feedback is coming in and would divvy it out the committee to look at, to review between now and our next meeting, which is in January. So eventually we'll get to that more focused feedback that they'll send us. But right now we're dealing with these common themes that are emerging across stakeholder groups. So if you want to go to that next slide, Jamie.
Hey, before you leave this slide real quick, could you just give an example on bullet 3 there at the bottom? Ensure whatever's currently funded outside the BEP is included in the new formula.
Yeah, and Jamie, you correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever we don't want to take away, or some of the feedbacks that don't take away what we are, what's currently being funded. So nothing less. It would really be building on the current model, and almost like above and beyond what we're doing right now. So that's something I've heard in some of the forums we've done as a chamber as well, in especially in Southeast. So it was.
So what would be an example of something that's currently funded outside the BEP that would need to be included?
Uh, what would be an example, Jamie, that you? I'm trying to think of something.
So sometimes we even have, districts will say, I'm having to fund really unique positions in my district. I'm having to fund some facilities work. So what are some of the things that are currently outside of the BEP that we think could possibly be part of a new funding formula?
So those would be specific grant requests to the state?
Well,
Go ahead, Jared.
I can just say I can give a concrete example of when we were in Bradley County doing a forum. The superintendent was talking about they fund 400 positions in Bradley County beyond what BEP covers. So they're either pulling that from some of their title money, maybe, or some grant money, or so it goes beyond what that per pupil. A lot of districts pay for elementary guidance counselors because within the BEP formula is something like 1 for every 300 students, so that a lot of elementary schools there wouldn't be enough money from BEP to pay for an elementary counselor, so that's something they pay for, or additional school nurses, things like that.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Any other questions on this one before we go on? All right. Next slide, Jamie.
Right before we move to the next slide, don't forget, in the meeting number 3 Google Drive folder, which I've just dropped in the chat, there are lots and lots of resources in there this go round, tons that really address the questions and concerns that were raised during last call. Some of them were consistent across subcommittees, and so other subcommittees have the same batch of resources. Some have additional or fewer. But you will see in here, particularly, there's Texas, Ohio. There's one other one in here. Oh, Maryland.
Indiana.
Yeah. There are also some other documents in here that could really help you out. And there is a page called resource links. So that little resource links could possibly tag on to an awful lot of kind of questions and concerns. And Ralph, to your point, like what is it that other states found outside of the BEP that they are including, or outside of their funding formula that they are including in their new funding formula? So those resources can help us out too.
And also on this call we were on earlier, they said the state that most closely reflects Tennessee as far as demographics and things like that Indiana.
Oh, we lost your audio, Jared. There you are.
About now? Okay, sorry. I was just saying we were told that Indiana is the most comparable state to Tennessee as far as demographics and funding goes. So they're a good example to look to when trying to understand some of the shifts that we might make. All right. So when we're talking about the base and this general feedback that we've gotten so far is that it includes the content that's currently being discussed in the subcommittees, and for example, those resources that the committee believe are critical to include in a state formula. And below, you'll see a little bullet list that the resources that have been consistently named, and they identify statewide trends based on the forums, but also that the state has provided. And also as a chamber, we did some forums, and these were almost the exact same themes that we were hearing. So at a high level here, these are the things that most stakeholder groups have been vocal about. And then what we need to do is provide feedback on the components of this list to say, yes, we agree that these are the right ones, or change or modify some of these, or if there's something that we feel like should be added. So we've got something to work from in these different categories, and it's up to us to either check the box on them or say that it doesn't make sense, or here's what you're missing. So I don't know, do we want to go through all these first, Jamie, and then revisit them to see if there's, or do we want to talk about it as we go through?
I think we can probably touch base on all of these, just to give a kind of good overview, and then return to that really deep discussion about what fits where.
Okay. All right.
I think you had a question.
Well, I was looking at this list, and the one that starts to catch my attention is counselors. And I think I talked about this a little bit during our last meeting. I'm unsure whether counselors refers to academic counselors or career counselors or mental health counselors. So I'm looking for some kind of clarification on what that means as presented here.
Good
What
point.
counselors means as presented here. I also note that, the next bullet says school psychologists. So I'm suspecting that the term counselors does not include mental health professionals that are addressing the student body's, mental health needs, but I don't know. How do we find out what that means?
I will absolutely put that on our list today.
Yeah. And I'll tell you this. Sorry, I just, the assumption I made just based on my experience in K-12 is that counselors at the elementary level deal more with emotional type things with students and supporting students in that regard, versus a high school counselor might do a little of both of career counseling and the emotional side. But the school psychologists are the ones that administer the testing for students, like they're referred to special ed. So that's a pretty unique role within schools. It's not typically like a psychologist on staff that's going to work with students. It's a lot of assessments and being in the special populations meetings, the IEP meetings with families. So, but definitely, I think, Jamie, if you want to make sure that we have clarity so we know what, but that's the assumption I'm making.
Well, my response to that would be to ask this subcommittee, would we agree that counseling the student for their academic, on their academics and their career path, meaning what courses should you take, or, how are you doing with certain courses, and what courses are you taking to path yourself the way you want to into post-secondary college or career? Would we agree that that type of counseling is a different skill set from mental health counseling and, things that are associated with psychology and emotional health?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's for sure. And a lot of times, honestly, it depends on the size of the school. Like a lot of rural high schools, the guidance counselor wears both those hats. So they do career counseling and their assessment. They might be the assessment coordinator and any kind of emotional type counseling. And then larger high schools, like I can use Bearden High School, Knoxville, for example. I know they've got a career counselor for every grade level. And so in high school, and so, beyond those counselors that are charged with the emotional thing. So it really depends on the size of your high school as well.
Well, wouldn't we agree
Jared,
that,
sorry, I would say, I mean, Dobbins Bennett is a large high school as well, but we don't have career counselors for every grade. So, our counselors, we don't have enough, even at our large high school, to be able to properly assess a student pathway for a student, but also properly assess the emotional side of a student as well. So, I took it as counselors being career counselors within the school system. And then, of course, the school psychologist, obviously being the separate part of that as well. So,
wouldn't we, as a Chambers of Commerce and Industry Subcommittee, want any new formula to actually make a distinction between those two things and to make sure that they are adequately supported by state funding?
we have had many discussions, I will tell you, from what the work that we're doing in workforce development here at our chamber about, and I think there was this, I think it was companies in Texas with a school. We kind of looked at that model when we were bringing our major business and industry together to talk about student pathways and career counseling, that there were industries in Texas that came together and they were paying for a CTE career counselor in one of the high schools and said, you actually work for us. We're going to pay your salary. This is what we want you to focus on, because we're focusing right now on CTE education. And so this is all we want you to do. We don't want you to do lunch duty. We don't want you to do work the bus line. We don't want you to do any of that. We are paying your salary, and this is what we want you to do. And so the industry kind of took it upon themselves because they weren't getting the proper funding to fund those positions. And so we have talked about that even here. What would that look like? I mean, we're not at that. We're not doing that as of right now, but we've had many discussions around that before.
What I'm saying is,
Yeah.
isn't that important
And I-
enough to business and industry to make sure that that gets covered in a state formula so that every district in Tennessee has access or can provide that type of thing without having to kind of do it yourself with local industry, which, I mean, is great for certain places that have that core of industry that's engaged and can provide the funding, but is not so great maybe for those districts that are resource challenged.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think in particular, something like career counselors really does apply to our committee. And I can give you another concrete example, and then we'll move on. But in the district where my wife is an assistant principal, they've only got one behavior intervention specialist for the entire district. So that is the service on high school, middle school, and like it's 7 schools, the intervention specialist. I'm sorry, 7 elementary schools. So that's just an impossible ask to have somebody one per district. So those are the kinds of positions that I think people would like to see more. For me, a lot of what I hear on input, it is around human capital investments. That's what I hear districts and other stuff. Most of the money is tied to getting more people supported in the districts.
Hey, could I throw a thought
All
in?
right, you want to go to the next slide? Oh,
Not next slide yet.
okay, not yet.
I have been listening patiently. Hey, just 2 quick thoughts on this one. Number one, across the state, it would be important to have consistency in these 5 categories. So to me, when I think about local funding and state funding, I tend to think about where does consistency need to be created across the state. So I'm agreeing with what Pat says, but across the 5, I think it's important to have consistency. And then the second thing that particularly when it comes to counselors and school psychologists, there are assessment tools that are important for those people to have access and to be able to use on a regular basis. And I think funding of those assessment tools could be an important component in those two categories. I know that there is a wide range of assessment tools at use in districts across the state. And frankly, some of them are really good at measuring interest and aptitude at all grade levels, and some of them are terrible. So I just wanted to throw a thought in there for those two bullets, that having access to effective assessment tools for all students at each grade level, I think, is important too. Okay, done.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that, and I would add that such assessment tools have to or should measure both aptitude and interest. I mean, measuring one without the other is, I mean, interest is, I mean, if we're measuring interest among middle school students, I mean, they're kind of, interested in things just based on God knows what they got exposed to. I think it's important that almost maybe as a matter of state policy, that we make sure that those tools are available as early as middle school across the board in this state at some level, and certainly in secondary school level, and that they've got to be quality tools that actually produce actionable information for students and for their parents and for their guidance counselors or academic and career counselors. I would almost want to take that second bullet, counselors, and split out academic and career counseling as a separate bullet, just to differentiate it from the type of counseling that's not academic and career, which is also important. But I think the formula, and this is based on a lot of feedback we've gotten from our membership and in talking with people for months and even years, that's important enough for where it needs to get kind of dedicated, and it needs to start at the middle school level when students are making and their parents are making their pathing decisions about what courses they're going to take and what's going to equip them for post-secondary, and that's happening at middle school.
Pat, sorry to interrupt, but I'm going to give a concrete example. We funded a pilot for youth science to be used in MNPS schools. One of the things that happened as a result was that we found that female students had generally a high aptitude and a low interest in technology. And so we used the academies of Nashville as a way to inject technology people into the classroom. And the next time the test was taken, the female students that had the aptitude showed a much higher interest because they knew more. And then finally, there was a lot of data given to the counselors about each of those individual students that provided them the opportunity to guide. So my only real point here is that if we're going to have these people working in the schools, they need to have the tools. And across the state, it's helpful if that is a consistent resource or funding level. I'm really trying to be compact in my comments, though.
No, I think this is why this is showing up consistently among stakeholders, because it is very important. So, it's good conversation for us to have. Any other comments in this area? All right, next one, Jamie. So, weights and weighting different students based on needs is something that we've talked about a little, and I think we mentioned last meeting there are almost 40 states already have some type of this weighting system in their formula. So here are some different components that go into a potential weighted system that other states utilize. Doesn't mean that that's what we would do, but here's some of what's coming to the surface in a lot of the comments. So economically disadvantaged and concentration of poverty, and this would include rural and urban students, students with disability that with different tiers based on the costs that are built into the different services students get. The English language learners that again, there would be tiers built in to based on the students' individual levels. Then rural in general and sparsity, which again would be different from economically disadvantaged. And Jamie, I don't know, I haven't looked at it enough, but and maybe you've heard some of these conversations, but theoretically, a formula could be created where there's funding based on being a rural student, but also maybe if they're economically disadvantaged within a rural community, there would be additional funding. I don't know if that's the case, but I think that's an assumption that I'm hearing from a lot of people, and whether that's what comes out of this. Have you heard anything if you can get like multiple of these weights for each student?
So I think that's absolutely part of the process we're working through right now. So if that is a recommendation from a subcommittee that we really need to consider, is there a way to stack those weights for students? Then I think this is a place to do it. So is the conversation out there? Absolutely. Is this the place to discuss it and make it a recommendation? That would be up to you all.
Yeah. And I mean, man, as I think about all the different variables that go into this, whatever comes out of these recommendations and ultimately we land on as a state, I used to think BEP was complicated, but I'm sure that there's something out there to help facilitate this, but I can't imagine having to calculate all these different variables into a new formula. Pat, got a question or comment?
I was going to say on this point, I don't know what the specific weights are, but as we've been talking about this, I've been sneaking a peek at some of the other resources that were on the resource links that were set out for this particular meeting. One of those is a website called EdBuild. And I'm looking since somebody talked about Indiana as having demographics that are fairly close to Tennessee's, comparatively speaking. I've been looking at what Indiana's formula looks like, and wouldn't you know it, they have a primarily student-based funding formula, and there's a fixed base amount per student, but there are some increased funding categories, including increased funding for students from low-income households and for districts with high concentrations of low-income students. They provide a kicker also for English language learners. There's one for gifted and talented. There's increased funding for career and technical education programs and special ed, and concentrated into districts based on concentrations of students from low-income households, and et cetera. So I think that, you know, there's some answers, comparatively speaking, and looking around, you know, at least what I'm looking at right now suggests that there could be some answers as to how things get weighted under a potential new Tennessee formula, you know, simply by doing some comparative analysis.
Yeah, I agree. Any other comments on these bullets as things that would be important to a new formula? Anything you think that might be missing, or any thoughts reflecting on what has emerged so far in initial conversations?
You know, the only thing I wanted to offer was I was a little surprised to see that gifted and dyslexic was not more emphasized in the feedback, because those do create, particularly when it comes, well, dyslexic when it comes to reading, you know, requires a lot of resource, and data indicates that there are a lot of dyslexic young people that go undiagnosed. And so that was one that sort of surprised me, and I wondered if the gifted and dyslexic shouldn't rise up there. The other thing I was wondering about a little bit was the fast growing and the charter enrollment. Just wondering if a student has the characteristics to receive weighted funding regardless of whether they're going to a charter school or wherever, why wouldn't that just apply for that category? Same with fast growing. You know, I just kind of felt a little bit like those bottom two bullets were a little surprising to me in this category, in this weighted category. I don't know if I clearly expressed my thought there, but again, I'm trying to be short.
Yeah, I got it, Ralph, and you know, and that's something that as definitely as a member of this committee, we can include on our priority list. Feel like something that's something we feel like should be included. That's what we're here for. So, any other thoughts on
the
this?
money follows the student, then it can follow them to a charter school, it can follow them to any school. And if the system is a fast growing system, you know, that money should still follow the student based on the other weighted criteria. Okay, I'm done.
And if it's a student-based formula, then that student-based formula should organically grow in terms of, you know, there should be more funding if there are more students, if the money is done on a per student basis.
Yeah,
I would think.
Yeah, I agree. So, of these, are there any that you wouldn't support? So let's start there. If you think there's something on the list that shouldn't be there in some manner, not really debating the amount of the weight, but just if this is something that should be considered.
Well, to Ralph's point, about charter enrollment, I would generally agree with that. You know, why differentiate charters from other types of public schools? A school is a school if this funding follows the student, no matter what institution or what particular school they're going into.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if that is because some charters are more expensive but per pupil just because of some of the things they do at the charter. I'm not sure. That's one thing I have not heard in at least in this light mentioned. I've heard charters, some folks that have said they don't feel like charters should get or students should get additional money if they go to a charter. But Jamie, have you in some of the forums and feedback you've heard, do you know what they mean by charter enrollment?
I do not, but I captured it right here in the notes
Okay.
for us to find out.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. Any other thoughts on these components that, as far as something besides charter, do you feel like that should not be considered? Or what about, is there something you think should be on this list that's not there that you think should be a part of a weighted system?
One thing I noticed is it says that areas that have not received as much feedback, that previously have been considered. For me, anytime I see like with small class size, the weight for that, as far as our, the students being able to, have more hands-on time and things like that, and one-on-one with teachers. So I think that'd be something for me to look at with class size, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, and I've heard class size mentioned. I haven't actually heard it as part of the weighting, but that makes sense. And that might be something we could explore, see how other states are handling that.
I had one other question too, and it had to do with technology. It had to do with the use and application of technology. When I think about weights, I'm thinking about students that do or don't have access to, don't have broadband access. They don't have, the equipment, the tablets or whatever. I just haven't thought about it deeply enough to be able to say it should be a weight But if there is innovation in the classroom that is tied to technology and students don't have access to technology or they don't have the appropriate tools, I wonder if that isn't a weighting consideration somewhere down the line. Yeah, I mean, look, we all know pockets where students just don't have access to technology for one reason or the other. And so anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. We're not at a definitive stage yet, right? We're just discussing, correct?
Correct. Yeah. And this is not even the more focused feedback that we'll ultimately get. This is feedback that that has been received and consistently as parts of that pyramid of components. So yeah, this is all preliminary.
Well, I love the start of the process, which is generated from the community, what's on their mind. I just wonder if at some further point there isn't some stimulus to some of those people to say, have you thought about this? So anyway, good process. That was just a thought that occurred when I read this page.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. All right. And we'll be revisiting all this. So this is helping us just get our thoughts together too, as we move forward with some of that focus feedback that'll be specific to our committee. All right, additional dollars, and these are the areas that receive the most positive feedback from stakeholders of what might be considered additional funding. So this is, and I would say that some of these are that the public has given feedback on stakeholders. I think initially, from at least with the forums we've been having, it's been majority people in the K-12 space and local policymakers showed up to our forums, like city council, school boards, county commission. So I think some of it has to do maybe with the stakeholders we've heard from initially, because, and then I think as we go forward, we might, with more of the surveys going out, things like that, we might see some different ones. But here are the ones that have risen to the top so far: is financial literacy, and that's helping students understand. This actually, I think, probably in a lot of our wheelhouses is local chambers sponsors programs like this, and middle school CTE which also gets back to exploring career paths, career awareness earlier, and matching up to Pat and Ralph's points about their interests and aptitudes and identifying those earlier. Innovative high school models, which we've got some of those examples around the state, but a lot of them are dependent on some type of grant dollars or additional funding beyond the BEP. So I think the ability to expand programs like that into other schools is something I've heard for years before this conversation. And then RTI, which is response to intervention. It's if you're not familiar with it, it's a tiered academic approach to really meeting students where they are in their ability level, and it's outside of the special education program. And then high dosage tutoring, which is even more important right now as we look at the learning loss recovery from the pandemic. And I think this goes beyond even the additional technology and just having students sit in front of a computer and try to just do more. This really takes that sweat equity from educators to work with students, and that gets fairly expensive pretty quickly. So these are the topics or the items that have in these initial conversations risen to the top. So, is there any of those you want to talk about? Think that need clarity on what they mean so that we're on the same page as we discuss them further, or something you see that's glaringly missing from this list.
I would say that the first three of those really resonate with me pretty strongly. And I'm also, as I say that, trying to think about whether, from a business community point of view, those things are additional dollars types. If I'm understanding it correctly, additional dollars are sort of the nice to have, or whether any of those are really kind of things that we as a business community think ought to be kind of moved up a priority list into more of a core funding posture. I don't know, but financial literacy is one of those things that really is. I think it has a workforce development component to it, and it also has a lot to do with whether or not a public education student in this state, is able to get on and stay on a productive post-secondary path. Increasingly, they're sort of victimized by bad choices, and to the extent that those not so good choices can be headed off by some education and some emphasis on financial literacy, I think that would be a good thing. I have also noticed, in a kind of an unrelated thing, while I was looking for some information relatively recently on financial literacy, I noticed that there's not really a financial literacy component in our social studies standards in middle school. If I was looking at it correctly, I've got some notes here, but there's not a whole lot in certain grades in financial literacy. It's like career awareness. The middle school grades are really where the rubber starts meeting the road and where people start to get pathed or well or not well. Same with CTE. I think there are, I'm not sure how that's defined here on this slide, but CTE opportunities, I think, are increasingly important to fund at a middle school level, in addition to the high school level.
Yeah, agreed.
This is kind of a broad statement, but local school systems just don't seem to have the money often in their budget to attempt innovation. And I just wonder if the state, in this additional nice to have or whatever category, couldn't be a little bit of a venture capitalist in helping to pilot scalable innovation, whether it's the application of technology, or it is a different approach to curriculum design, or it is something having to do with a specific group of students that have, a large cohort or whatever. Just again, this is the place where I thought additional dollars applied to innovation in the school system, just a thought.
I think something else is funding for travel, for post-secondary opportunities, for business and industry tours, anything like that to help provide transportation, sub-pay if needed, anything like that. That's something that we have really done a lot of, pre-COVID in our system, and getting the students out and about into, like I said, post-secondary, into business and industry, for them to be able to see hands-on what they're doing. And I know earlier we talked about, I think someone had mentioned about youth science and being able to see a lot of interest. The interest level was low, but the skills set was high with female students. We've seen that in one of our local, like robotics. They didn't realize how well girls were able to manipulate and do things with the robots until they had them in the facility doing it, and opened up their eyes a little bit into recruitment and things like that, and also with the students being able to do that. So it's a good thing. So I would love to have dollars, because that's what we've had grants and different things, but grants go away, and be able to have that built in will be wonderful.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I don't know how we address that from a funding formula or mechanism standpoint, maybe there's some sort of combination of some minimum amount of funding that's in the formula with, with additional funding being available through competitive grants or something, meaning no matter where you are in the state, if you've got a good idea, that deserves funding, a good innovation idea that's deserving of it, there, we ought to, the state ought to be contributing to that on some level.
Yeah.
And
I think that's.
I was sorry, Jared, I was going to also second that point about CTE travel. I noticed in looking at the current BEP that there's a category for CTE travel, and I think it's one of the lower funded ones toward the in the back part of the formula.
Yeah. And I hate to rush this, but we got a couple more things we got to cover. Because I want to be mindful of y'all's time. I can already tell we're going to have to go a few minutes over, but we can go to that next slide, Jamie, and see if we can at least do a light touch on some of these final things. So outcomes, and these are the areas that received positive feedback. And I've heard mixed things as far as an outcomes category, period, as far as some schools getting more money as a reward for positive outcomes. I've heard some people in favor of a school that if it's a failing school, they need more money to help them get the outcomes they want. But so I think just from an ideological standpoint, there's a couple camps on outcomes as a strategy anyway. But here are some of the things that's risen to the top. The early post-secondary opportunities that high school students are required to complete before they graduate, and AP course completion, early industry certificates and certification, work-based learning, completion metric, which is beyond just being in a program or leaving school early to go work somewhere. Closing the achievement gap. So again, that would mean additional funding for schools that aren't at the achievement level or growth level, academic growth level they should be. Reading proficiency, that's always, since we had our first one-room schoolhouse in the country, I think literacy and that third grade literacy percentage has always been in the background of a blue billion different strategies in education. And then differentiated compensation. And that's also, a lot of people don't realize we've had some differentiated pay strategies in districts going all the way back to around 2011, somewhere in there. So really a decade, and that was initially through a grant and Race to the Top, and then other districts have adopted that since then. So teachers getting paid more based on achievement or certain other criteria. So I would be interested, what's this committee's view or perspective on an outcomes-based approach? Do you think schools that are doing well should be rewarded with more money, or the same amount, or even less money? They're potentially, depending on how a weighted system might work, a school that's doing really well might get less money, and then a school that's struggling might get more. So what are y'all's thoughts on that, just from a philosophical standpoint?
I think that's tough. I do think, I guess on the one side of it, if it were that you were struggling, I think there needed to be, I don't know, a type of rubric or something to show, okay, this is what we're doing, or this is why we need more funding to do something. Because I think it's one of those things where a lot of times there might be a problem, but no matter how much money you throw at it, if it might be the wrong person in the role, I don't know, it could be a lot of things, but in order to see, and then all the ones that are doing well, what are you doing? So can you do this without funding? Do you need more? So I think there has to be some type of system in place in order to do either side of it, really.
And to that point, The one thing on this list that kind of sounds like, you know, what you were just stating is, you know, the closing the achievement gap, meaning you want to help the schools that are in districts that are appropriately aimed but not well enough resourced to be able to get up to the next stair, so to speak. I wonder if so that's observation number one. Number two is I'm thinking that AP course completion and industry certificates or certification are those two are actually included in EPSOs, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm thinking about EPSOs right, they are inclusive of industry certifications and AP course completion. So that's point number two. Point number three is maybe there's a way to get at to sort of reward the systems or the schools that are or the districts that are, you know, poised to succeed, and they just need a little infusion of a little more help, or it gets to what should we be rewarding, and maybe to marry all those ideas together, maybe we could come up with something, or somebody could come up with something where, you know, the schools or districts that demonstrate growth or trajectory, upward trajectory or growth or in improvement, if you will, in EPSO related categories could receive some outcome-based funding. It would have to be weighted properly so that, you know, you're not just rewarding the most affluent districts who've got the most money to do the most, but is there a way that we can sort of reward growth in things like EPSOs that are aimed at post-secondary success that we know contribute to post-secondary success?
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this? Again, we're going to revisit all these, but anything before we move on?
You know, I think the first two bullets, the hard thing is, you know, that students that have unusual challenges would probably benefit by more resource to fill in some of those gaps. But then the question becomes, does every student deserve the opportunity to achieve at that higher level? I have to say, I really struggle with this one a little bit in thinking of that, because logically it's just telling me that from an outcomes perspective, you know, economically disadvantaged students with disabilities and English learners are going to have a more difficult time earning dual credit or dual enrollment. And by the same token, I don't want anybody to be disadvantaged in getting that higher education. So sorry, but I'm undecided on that one.
So if it were done thoughtfully, though, Ralph, you know, couldn't somebody come up with a kind of a point system where, you know, you're getting extra points for achieving those types of outcomes for those particular cohorts, you know, economically disadvantaged students with disabilities, and English learners, just to pick three.
Yeah.
Or maybe that needs.
I know 20 years ago, there was a process in Seattle where their local school system rewarded performing schools with more money and more access to programming. And it lasted about 5 years, and then it was crushed by the community over, you know, social conflict. So they returned back to their old ways. So if anybody's interested, Seattle 20 years ago might have been a good thing to look at.
Yeah.
Was it crushed out of like equity objections?
Yeah, they had actually made promises to expand the schools that were doing well and engage more students, and they never did that. So in essence, you know, students had reduced access, or they didn't have access to those higher performing schools that was promised. And that funding was supposed to create more capacity. I hate to be the guy, but I gotta go. So
Yeah, I apologize. I think if y'all could do this for me, because we need to capture something to start working from. If you'll go to that next slide, Jamie, the one that our buckets, how they're labeled, our must have, should have, nice to have, long shot. If you don't mind emailing that to me, at least one thing, I mean, you can do more, but at least one thing to you feel like needs to be in each of these categories, so we can start putting that together. And then before our next meeting, I can combine those and send it out, so that we've got something to work from in our, once we get that feedback coming in. And I know, Jamie, you wanted a couple minutes to say something. I'm sorry, we had a great discussion on base.
Yeah, actually, I don't think there's any harm, no foul at this point. I think it's great discussion and well needed. One of the things I want to do before we wrap is just kind of tell you a little bit about the notes that I took. Just make sure that I'm capturing the what the team has surfaced, either as questions, concerns, or just thoughts that are happening, thoughts that are getting out there. So I'm going to read through these. This is my protocol that I have to follow. I will then send it on to Jared. Jared will give it a visual thumbs up and send me an email back that says, yes, go ahead and send on. So when we were on the slide around BASE, one of the things that surfaced was having access to effective career assessment tools at all grade levels, measuring aptitude and interest, helpful if it's consistent, a consistent funding source across the state. Stop me at any point in time and tell me if I need to wordsmith. So you'll just have to interrupt me. Weights, can weights be stacked for students? We're a little surprised that dyslexia and gifted did not surface necessarily in these trends. Bottom two bullets, fast growing and charter enrollment, are also surprising. Why differentiate here if the funding follows the student? Why call these out separately? Need clarification. What are we considering charter enrollment? One of the things we don't know if we would support is charter enrollment. We need to know more information, definitions. What does that mean? Class size is something to learn more about. Need to explore how other states are approaching class size. What about access to technology? Is this a weighting consideration down the line? Additional dollars, not really a financial literacy component yet. Is that included in the middle school CTE listed on this slide? If not, this would be a nice addition. And also funding for travel for post-secondary efforts. On the outcome slide, some type of system in place to measure progress towards outcomes. EPSO completion, reward growth for aims toward post-secondary success, ensuring that we approach it thoughtfully. And Ralph suggested looking at Seattle's experience with this about 20 years ago. Anything you would change, add, edit, omit?
The travel suggestion, as I recall, was specifically around CTE travel.
Okay.
Or travel for CTE related purposes.
Okay. Thank you.
CTE post-secondary, any type of opportunity there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I put CTE and post-secondary related purposes. Anything else? That sound okay?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, Pat, you okay with that? Anything you'd add? Shift?
I'm trying to remember what all you just said.
And it was the Fast and Furious.
I think it sounded right.
Okay. Now remember, this is not anything that actually gets put into the final recommendations. These literally are thoughts on paper to kind of springboard you into the next meeting. So I'm just having to capture for, legal purposes. But this does not pin you into anything, by no means. Okay. Laura, anything on your end? Okay.
No, sounded good.
Okay.
All
Jerry?
right. Well, I will email everyone those 4 buckets, and we could get that before Christmas so I can compile it and send it back out for our meeting on January 7th, that'd be great. But I'll shoot that an email here in just a few minutes.
And just a quick reminder, the meeting has been shifted from Monday to Friday. So January 3rd is a state holiday, and that was the next meeting was scheduled on January 3rd. So it has shifted to Friday, same time, just different date. And this space between now and January 7th is really the opportunity to collect any way you can. Send it to the email. You can codify and send to the email, or you can actually hand that out, the email, pass that one out, share it with other folks, and have them submit. I even saw it on Facebook this week. So get it out there, get as much feedback as we can between now and then.
Great, thank y'all. We will progress every time. Y'all have a good Christmas.
Hey, Jamie, my calendar's, you own the meeting link or the calendar invite for this thing?
Yep.
Okay. Mine is still showing January 3rd.
Okay. I'll double check it on my end. I might not have gotten you on there. Thank you for the heads up.
Thanks. Thank you all. See you.
Thank you. Y'all have a good Christmas.
Ho, ho, ho.
Bye.
Well, amen.